The massive crystal spires of the Galactic Medical Academy gleamed in the light of three suns, their surfaces reflecting a rainbow of colors across the courtyard where hundreds of alien students gathered. Today was different from any other day in the Academy's 1,000-year history. They were about to welcome their first human instructor. The Dean of the Academy, Professor Lin, stood tall on his four legs, his silver skin shimmering as he addressed the assembled crowd. His species came from a low-gravity world, giving him a height of nearly 12 feet, though his body was thin as a reed. "Today marks a historic moment," he announced, his translator converting his melodic whistles into standard galactic common. "We welcome an instructor from Earth, the Deathworld." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Most students had only heard stories about humans, tales of beings who evolved on a planet with crushing gravity, deadly bacteria, and extreme temperature variations. Some stories claimed humans could survive injuries that would kill most species, heal from broken bones, and continue fighting even when grievously wounded. The transport ship descended from the sky, its engines barely making a sound. The gathered aliens watched with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension as the airlock cycled. Dr. James Walker stepped out, and several students took involuntary steps backward. He wasn't particularly tall by human standards, maybe 6 feet, but his solid build made him look like a tank compared to the willowy aliens around him. "Thank you for the welcome," Dr. Walker said, smiling. His translator converted his words into the standard whistles and clicks of galactic common. "I'm honored to be here and excited to share Earth's medical knowledge with you all." Professor Lin gestured with one of his four arms. "Dr. Walker comes highly recommended from Earth's top medical institutions. He specializes in emergency medicine, a field where humans have unique expertise." In the crowd, a student named Twix, whose body was covered in iridescent scales, whispered to his classmate, "I heard humans can restart hearts by hitting the chest." "That can't be true, right?" His friend, a gaseous being contained in a protective suit, pulsed with uncertainty. Dr. Walker followed Professor Lin into the Academy building, his heavy footsteps echoing in the crystalline hallways. The walls were designed to be soothing, changing colors in response to emotional states, but they seemed confused by the human's presence, flickering between calming blue and cautionary yellow. "Your quarters have been modified to Earth-standard gravity," Professor Lin explained, leading him to his room. "We had to reinforce the floor significantly. I hope you'll be comfortable." "This is perfect," Dr. Walker replied, setting down his bag with a thud that made nearby students jump. "When can I start teaching?" "Your first class is scheduled for tomorrow. We've assigned you 20 students for the initial course. They're all top performers, selected from different species to maximize the spread of knowledge." Professor Lin's skin rippled with what humans had learned was excitement. "I must admit, some of our faculty expressed concerns about teaching human medical techniques." Dr. Walker nodded understanding. "Because they seem violent." "Precisely. Our traditional healing methods focus on gentle energy manipulation and chemical rebalancing. The idea of physically manipulating injured bodies is challenging for many species to accept. By the end of this course, they'll understand that sometimes being gentle isn't what saves lives," Dr. Walker said confidently. "I've brought training equipment designed to handle the full force of human emergency procedures. It should help demonstrate why our methods work." As they discussed the curriculum, students passed by the open door, sneaking glances at the human. Word spread quickly through the academy about the strange new instructor who moved with such purpose and spoke of medical procedures that sounded more like combat techniques. That evening, as the three suns set, casting the crystal spires in deep purples and blues, Dr. Walker reviewed his lesson plans. Tomorrow would be his first chance to bridge the gap between human and alien medicine. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was ready for the challenge. After all, humans had always been good at proving themselves against impossible odds. The lecture hall fell silent as Dr. Walker activated the holographic display. 20 alien students watched nervously as a three-dimensional image of a human body appeared in the center of the room. The morning light filtered through the crystal walls, casting rainbow patterns across their varied faces. Today, we'll cover basic human first aid techniques, Dr. Walker began, his voice calm but firm. Let's start with something simple, CPR, or cardiopulmonary resuscitation. A student raised one of their tentacles. Instructor, what does that mean in simple terms? It means restarting a heart that has stopped beating by pushing on the chest, Dr. Walker explained. The hologram zoomed in to show a cross-section of a human chest. When someone's heart stops, we push down hard enough to compress the chest by about 2 inches. A collective gasp filled the room. Twix, the scaled student from yesterday, turned a pale shade of green. You break the ribcage, he asked, his translator barely managing to convey his horror. Sometimes, yes. Broken ribs are common during proper CPR. It's better to have a patient with broken ribs than a dead patient. Dr. Walker demonstrated the motion on the hologram. The sound of cracking ribs made several students wobble in their seats. One student, a crystalline being named Prism, actually became slightly transparent from shock. But wouldn't that kill the patient? They asked, their voice chiming like bells. Humans are remarkably resilient, Dr. Walker said with a slight smile. Our bodies can heal from broken bones in just a few weeks. Now let's talk about rescue breathing. He changed the hologram to show mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. 3 students promptly excused themselves from the class, their various appendages shaking as they hurried out. You put your mouth on the injured person, asked a gaseous student named Cloud, their protective suit swirling with patterns of disbelief. That's so intimate. And wouldn't you catch their diseases? We take precautions, Dr. Walker explained patiently. We use protective barriers, and our immune systems are quite robust. Now watch carefully as I demonstrate the head tilt, chin lift maneuver. The remaining students watched in fascinated horror as he showed how to open an airway. When he mentioned checking for a pulse by pressing fingers against the neck, one student actually fainted, their anti-gravity unit barely catching them before they hit the floor. I understand this seems aggressive, Dr. Walker said, pausing the demonstration. But these techniques save thousands of lives on Earth every year. In emergency medicine, gentleness must sometimes give way to effectiveness. A brave student near the front raised their eye stalk. What about pain management? Surely you don't just hurt people to save them. Actually, let's talk about emergency pain management, Dr. Walker said, bringing up a new hologram. Sometimes we need to inject medications directly into muscle tissue using needles. The image of a hypodermic needle appeared, and the class collectively moved back a few feet. Twix's scales rattled audibly. You pierced the protective outer layer, deliberately. Professor Lin had entered the back of the classroom and looked equally disturbed. Is there no other way? It's the fastest way to deliver medication in an emergency, Dr. Walker explained. Speed often makes the difference between life and death. As the class continued, Dr. Walker covered splinting broken bones, controlling bleeding with direct pressure, and the Heimlich maneuver. Each new technique seemed more shocking than the last to the alien students. Yet beneath their horror, a few began showing signs of grudging interest. Remember, Dr. Walker said as the class ended, tomorrow we'll have practical demonstrations. I've brought special training dummies that can simulate human injuries. We'll practice these techniques hands-on. The students filed out, many still shaking, but a few were talking excitedly among themselves. Professor Lin approached Dr. Walker after the room emptied. That was enlightening, the dean said carefully. Though I worry about the practical session tomorrow. Are you sure the students can handle it? Dr. Walker smiled confidently. They'll do better than you expect. Sometimes the best way to overcome fear is to face it directly. That's another thing humans are good at teaching. The medical training lab buzzed with nervous energy as Dr. Walker wheeled in the human-design practice dummy. Unlike the gentle simulation pods the aliens normally use, this dummy was solid, heavy, and disturbingly realistic. Its chest could compress, its joints could bend, and it even had synthetic skin that felt unnervingly real. Today's practical session will focus on CPR, Dr. Walker announced, setting up the dummy in the center of the room. Who wants to try first? The room became so quiet you could hear the hum of the anti-gravity units keeping some students afloat. Twix's scales flickered with anxiety, and Cloud's gaseous form swirled faster inside their containment suit. Come on, Dr. Walker encouraged. The dummy has sensors that will tell us if you're using the right amount of force. He demonstrated the proper hand position on the dummy's chest. Remember, push down 2 inches, let the chest fully rebound, and keep a steady rhythm. Finally, Prism floated forward, their crystalline body catching the light. I will try. They chimed nervously. But I don't want to damage the equipment. You won't, Dr. Walker assured them. These dummies are built to handle much more force than you'll use. Now, place your hands like this. Prism's first compression barely dented the surface. The dummy's sensor display showed a red light, indicating insufficient pressure. After several more gentle attempts, Dr. Walker shook his head. You need to push harder, much harder, like this. He demonstrated again, and the sound of the compression made several students wince. The dummy's display flashed green with each proper compression. But that's so violent, Prism protested, their crystalline form clouding with distress. Let me try, came a quiet voice. Everyone turned to see Twix step forward, his scales now a determined bronze color. I've been studying human physiology since yesterday's class. I think I understand why this works. Twix took position beside the dummy, placed his scaled hands in the correct position, and pushed down. The first compression was too gentle, but he adjusted his force. On his third try, the dummy's display flashed green. Excellent, Dr. Walker exclaimed. Keep that rhythm. Remember to count. 30 compressions, then 2 rescue breaths. The other students watched in amazement as Twix maintained the compressions, his initial fear giving way to concentration. The steady thump-thump-thump of proper CPR filled the room. Now for the rescue breathing part, Dr. Walker said after Twix finished his set. He pulled out a protective barrier. Who wants to try? Cloud surprisingly moved forward. Our species understands the importance of gas exchange. They said, their containment suit extending a specialized tube. We can adapt our equipment for this purpose. Over the next 2 hours, each student took turns practicing. There were many nervous attempts, several failures, and more than a few moments of hesitation. But gradually, something changed in the room. The horror of yesterday's lecture began to transform into understanding. Professor Lin arrived near the end of the session to find his students fully engaged. Some were practicing chest compressions, others were learning to check pulses, and a few were even practicing the recovery position. Notice how they're getting more confident, Dr. Walker said quietly to the dean. Yesterday they were horrified by the theory. Today they're learning that these techniques have precise, scientific purposes. I must admit, Professor Lin replied, watching Twix successfully lead a group through a full CPR cycle, I didn't expect them to adapt so quickly. Perhaps there's something to be said for your direct approach. The session ended with an unexpected request from Prism. Could we practice more after regular hours? They asked, their crystalline form now clear and bright with enthusiasm. I want to make sure I get the force exactly right. Dr. Walker smiled. Of course. The lab will be open for practice all week. Just remember, in a real emergency, you might need to act without the dummy's helpful sensors. That's why we practice until the motions become natural. As the students filed out, discussing the day's lessons with growing excitement rather than fear, Dr. Walker began cleaning up the equipment. He caught snippets of their conversations, technical discussions about compression depth, questions about rescue breathing adaptations for different species, and even debates about the most efficient way to check for a pulse. Tomorrow, he said to himself, we'll practice the Heimlich maneuver. That should be interesting. The Academy's medical bay was usually quiet during afternoon hours. Most students were in classes, and the staff handled only minor injuries. Today started the same way, with Dr. Walker supervising a small group of students practicing bandaging techniques. The peace shattered when the emergency doors burst open. Two maintenance workers rushed in, carrying their unconscious colleague. The injured worker, a silicon-based being named Rock, had fallen from a high-maintenance platform. Their usually solid crystalline body was cracked in several places, and their core temperature readings were dropping rapidly. "Help!" one of the workers called out. The anti-gravity unit failed while Rock was fixing the atmospheric processors. The medical bay's regular staff froze. Silicon-based life forms were notoriously difficult to treat, and their traditional healing methods required hours of careful energy alignment. Time that Rock clearly didn't have. Dr. Walker sprang into action. Twix, check for responsiveness. Prism, get the emergency heating units. Cloud, analyze their breathing patterns. His voice cut through the panic, giving clear, direct orders. Twix rushed forward, his scales now a professional shade of blue. No response to voice or touch, he reported crisply. Core temperature 30% below normal. The regular medical staff watched in shock as the human and his students worked. Traditional protocol would have them waiting for a crystal healing specialist, but Rock's readings were dropping too fast. "We need to stabilize the core temperature first," Dr. Walker announced. Prism, position those heating units along the major cracks. Cloud, use your gas exchange abilities to check for internal fractures. Cloud's containment suit extended several specialized sensors. "Internal structure is compromised," they reported. Traditional healing would take too long. Dr. Walker pulled out a device he brought from Earth. "This is a molecular bonding agent," he explained quickly. "We use it for emergency repairs on silicon-based equipment, but I've modified it for medical use." The alien staff gasped. Using industrial materials for medical treatment was unheard of, but Rock's life signs were still dropping. "Twix, hold these edges together," Dr. Walker ordered, pointing to a major crack. "Prism, focus the heat right here. Cloud, monitor the core readings." Working with precise movements, Dr. Walker applied the bonding agent to the largest cracks. The substance glowed briefly as it hardened, creating temporary bridges across the damaged areas. Rock's readings began to stabilize. "Core temperature rising," Cloud announced, their gaseous forms swirling with excitement. "Internal pressure stabilizing." Professor Lin burst into the medical bay, having heard about the emergency. He stopped short at the sight before him. A human and 3 students performing what looked like engineering repairs on a patient, while the regular medical staff watched in amazement. "What are you doing?" he asked, his forelegs shifting nervously. "Saving a life," Dr. Walker replied without looking up. Sometimes emergency medicine means using unexpected solutions. "Twix, check the hardness of the bonding agent." Twix carefully tested the repaired areas. "Holding stable, instructor." Core readings approaching normal range. Gradually, Rock's crystalline body began to regain its natural luster. The emergency repairs weren't pretty, but they were effective. When Rock finally regained consciousness 20 minutes later, the medical bay erupted in relieved cheers. "That was unorthodox," Professor Lin said afterward, studying the medical readings. "Using industrial bonding agents, modified heating units, it goes against every medical tradition we have." "But it worked," Twix pointed out, his scales now a proud gold color. "Traditional methods would have taken too long." Dr. Walker nodded. "Emergency medicine isn't about following tradition. It's about keeping the patient alive until proper treatment is possible. Now Rock has time to receive traditional crystal healing properly." The regular medical staff gathered around, asking questions about the techniques they'd just witnessed. Even the most skeptical among them had to admit that the humans' methods, while shocking, had undeniably saved Rock's life. "Perhaps," Professor Lin said thoughtfully, "it's time we revised our emergency treatment protocols. Dr. Walker, would you be willing to train our regular staff as well as the students? Dr. Walker smiled. Of course. After all, that's why I'm here. To show that sometimes the best medicine isn't the gentlest, but the most effective. The day after Rock's accident, Dr. Walker's classroom was packed. News of the emergency treatment had spread quickly through the academy, and now even senior medical staff crowded the back of the room. Rock sat in the front row, their crystalline body showing the neat repair lines from yesterday's treatment. Today, Dr. Walker began. We're going to discuss why yesterday's emergency treatment worked. It's not enough to know how to do something. You need to understand why it works. Twix raised his scaled hand. Is that why you used the industrial bonding agent? Because you understood the chemistry of silicon-based life forms. Exactly. Dr. Walker nodded, bringing up a holographic display. On Earth, we often have to adapt industrial or engineering solutions for medical use. When you're dealing with life-threatening emergencies, you can't always wait for the perfect solution. Professor Lin moved to the front of the room. I've reviewed the medical logs from yesterday. Rock's core temperature dropped 43% below normal, according to our traditional protocols. He paused, his silver skin rippling. The patient would not have survived the wait for a crystal healing specialist. The room fell silent. Rock's crystalline form glowed softly. I want to tell everyone something, they chimed. When I was unconscious, I could still sense the emergency repairs. What felt like violence at first was actually caring, precise. Each action had a purpose. Clouds swirled thoughtfully in their containment suit. That's what we've been missing, isn't it? We saw human medical techniques as brutal because we didn't understand the purpose behind each action. Dr. Walker smiled. Healthcare isn't about being gentle or rough. It's about doing what's necessary to save lives. Sometimes that means breaking ribs during CPR. Sometimes it means using modified industrial materials to stabilize a silicon-based life form. Prism floated forward, their crystalline form clear with excitement. Could we develop a database of emergency adaptations, like how different industrial materials could be modified for various species? Now you're thinking like an emergency medical professional, Dr. Walker said proudly. In fact, I've already started working on something similar. He activated another holographic display, showing a chart of various materials and their potential medical applications. Professor Lin studied the chart with all four eyes. This is remarkable. You've mapped out emergency treatments for nearly every known species type in the galaxy. With help from my students, Dr. Walker added, their knowledge of their own species biology has been invaluable. Twix figured out how to modify dermal regenerators for scaled species. Cloud developed new gas exchange protocols. Prism improved our understanding of crystalline life form repairs. The senior medical staff in the back began taking notes. One of them raised an appendage. Could you show us how you modify that bonding agent? We have similar cases at least once per cycle, but we usually just stabilize and wait. Of course, Dr. Walker said. But first, let's understand the principles behind it. Rock, would you mind if we used your case as an example? Rock chimed happily. Please do. I'd rather my accident help others learn. Over the next hour, Dr. Walker broke down every decision made during yesterday's emergency. He explained how each technique, while appearing aggressive to alien eyes, was carefully calculated to save lives. The students and staff watched in growing understanding as the seemingly brutal methods revealed their underlying logic. Starting tomorrow, Professor Lin announced near the end of the class, we're expanding Dr. Walker's emergency medicine program. All medical staff will receive training in these techniques, and we'll be adding a permanent rapid response section to our medical bay. Twix's scales turned a bright, excited orange. Does this mean we'll get more practice dummies? Better than that, Dr. Walker replied. The Academy has approved funding for a full emergency simulation lab. We'll have practice equipment adapted for every known species type. As the class ended, students lingered to discuss the new developments. Rock demonstrated their healing progress to an amazed group of medical staff. Cloud and Prism were already sketching out ideas for new emergency protocols. "You know," Professor Lin said quietly to Dr. Walker, "when we first invited a human instructor, some thought it would be too dangerous. Now I'm wondering if not learning these techniques was the real danger all along." The new emergency simulation lab hummed with activity. 3 weeks had passed since Rock's accident, and the changes in the academy were remarkable. Students moved with confidence between practice stations, each designed to simulate different species' medical emergencies. "Watch this," Twix called out excitedly. He stood over a scaled species dummy, demonstrating a new technique he developed. "I combined the human chest compression method with our traditional scale pattern energy flow." Dr. Walker observed as Twix performed CPR, but with an interesting modification. His scaled hands glowed slightly at each compression point, channeling healing energy while maintaining the firm human-style pressure. "Fascinating," Cloud commented, their containment suit analyzing the results. "The healing energy penetrates 40% deeper when combined with physical force. This could revolutionize emergency care for scaled species." Across the lab, Prism worked with a group practicing crystal repair techniques. They had modified Dr. Walker's bonding agent to include traditional crystal harmonics. "The industrial compound works even better when it resonates at healing frequencies," they chimed proudly. Professor Lin entered the lab, accompanied by a group of visiting medical directors from other academies. The visitors watched in amazement as students demonstrated their hybrid techniques. "Here's the most exciting development," Dr. Walker said to the visitors, leading them to a central demonstration area. "Students, show them the multi-species emergency response protocol you've developed." The class gathered around a complex scenario, a simulated accident involving 3 different species types: crystalline, gaseous, and scaled. Twix, Cloud, and Prism took their positions. Traditional protocol would treat each patient separately, Twix explained, his scales a professional blue. "But we've learned to work together, combining our species' abilities with human emergency techniques." They demonstrated their new method. Cloud used their gaseous nature to quickly assess internal injuries, while Prism applied modified crystal healing. Twix followed with precision pressure points enhanced by scale energy. The entire process took less than 5 minutes, a fraction of the traditional treatment time. "Remarkable," one of the visiting directors said. "They're not just copying human methods. They're creating something entirely new." Dr. Walker nodded proudly. "Each species has unique medical traditions developed over thousands of years. The key wasn't to replace them, but to enhance them with human emergency protocols." A student rushed into the lab. "Emergency call from the spaceport. Tourist ship had a gravity malfunction. Multiple species injured. They're asking for our rapid response team." Professor Lin turned to Dr. Walker. "Are they ready?" "We're ready," Twix answered before Dr. Walker could speak. His scales now glowed with confident gold patterns. "We've been practicing for exactly this kind of situation." The students quickly gathered their modified emergency kits. Each kit contained a mix of traditional healing tools and human-inspired emergency equipment, adapted for different species. "Remember your training," Dr. Walker called out as they headed for the door. "Speed matters, but so does precision. Trust your instincts, but follow the protocols we've practiced." The visiting directors watched in surprise as the students moved with military precision. There was no hesitation, no fear, just focused determination. "When you first proposed this program," Professor Lin said to Dr. Walker, "I worried we might lose our traditional healing arts. Instead, we've made them stronger." In the distance, they could hear the emergency transport taking off. Inside, Twix and his teammates were already preparing their equipment, their movements sure and practiced. "That's the real lesson here," Dr. Walker replied. "Good medicine isn't about choosing between gentle and forceful, traditional and modern. It's about finding the right combination to save lives." The visiting directors nodded in agreement. One of them turned to Professor Lin. "We'll want to implement similar programs at our own academies. The galaxy needs more healers who can combine the wisdom of all species. As the day continued, the remaining students returned to their practice with renewed energy. Each one knew that somewhere in the spaceport, their classmates were proving that the best medical care came from understanding both the force of human methods and the gentleness of alien traditions. The Academy's great crystal hall sparkled with celebration lights as the first class of emergency medicine specialists prepared for graduation. Banners representing 100 different worlds hung from the ceiling, and the room was packed with dignitaries from across the galaxy. Dr. Walker stood proudly at the side of the stage, watching as Professor Lin addressed the crowd. The past 6 months had transformed these students in ways nobody had expected. Today, Professor Lin announced, his silver skin gleaming, "We celebrate not just the graduation of these students, but the birth of a new era in galactic medicine." In the front row, Twix sat with his scales shimmering in formal patterns of achievement. Next to him, Cloud's containment suit displayed honorary medals from 3 different medical organizations. Prism's crystalline form sparkled with the special honors they'd earned for their breakthrough in emergency crystal healing. "Our graduates have already saved over 200 lives," Professor Lin continued. "Their response to the spaceport accident alone has become a case study in multi-species emergency care." The screens around the hall showed highlights from their training. Twix performing his enhanced CPR technique, Cloud developing new gas exchange protocols, Prism demonstrating crystal repair methods. But the most impressive footage showed them working together, combining human emergency techniques with their own species' healing traditions. "When we first invited a human instructor to teach emergency medicine," Professor Lin said, "many thought it was a mistake. They said human medical techniques were too aggressive, too dangerous." He paused, all 4 eyes twinkling. Those same critics now send their own medical staff to learn these methods. Rock, fully healed and now working as a teaching assistant, chimed in agreement from their seat. The neat repair lines from their accident had become a badge of honor, proof that sometimes the best healing came from unexpected methods. Dr. Walker stepped forward to present the certificates. Each student had earned a unique specialization. Twix in rapid physical response, Cloud in emergency atmospheric treatment, Prism in crystal crisis care. But they had all mastered the core principle that effective emergency medicine knew no species boundaries. 6 months ago, Dr. Walker said to the graduates, "You were afraid to compress a practice dummy's chest. Today, you're being recruited by emergency response teams across the galaxy." It was true. Every graduate had received multiple job offers. Some would join spacecraft emergency crews, others would teach at other academies, and a few would help establish new emergency medical centers on various worlds. Twix stepped up to give the graduate speech, his scales now a confident gold. "We learned more than just medical techniques," he said. "We learned that what seems violent can be caring, what looks aggressive can be precise, and what feels foreign can become familiar." Cloud added their own comments, their containment suit pulsing with pride. "Our human instructor taught us to act quickly, but our own traditions taught us to heal deeply. Together, these approaches save more lives than either could alone." The ceremony concluded with a surprise announcement from Professor Lin. "The Galactic Medical Council has approved our proposal. Emergency medicine, combining human and traditional techniques, will become a standard part of medical training throughout the galaxy." The hall erupted in cheers. Dr. Walker felt a tap on his shoulder and turned to find a group of his students. "We have something for you," Prism said, floating forward. They presented him with a crystal medallion, created through their combined healing techniques. When he held it, he could feel the gentle pulse of traditional healing energy, alongside the strong, steady rhythm of human emergency protocols. "This represents what you taught us," Twix explained, his scales matching the medallion's glow. "That the best healing comes from understanding both strength and gentleness." As the celebration continued, news arrived of another emergency at the city's transport hub. Without hesitation, several graduates excused themselves and headed out, their new emergency kits ready. Dr. Walker watched them go, knowing they carried with them the best of both worlds. human determination and alien wisdom, emergency speed and healing patience, force and gentleness. They had become something new. Healers who could save lives in ways neither humans nor aliens could manage alone. "You know," Professor Lind said, standing beside him, "I think we've done more than train emergency medical specialists. We've helped bridge the gap between worlds." Dr. Walker touched the crystal medallion and smiled. "That's the best kind of healing there is."